Russian forces have secured additional parts of the industrial zone to the northwestern outskirts of Pokrovsk. Getting control over additional parts solidifies their cut-off of the E50 highway, which is one of the main supply routes that used to supply the Ukrainian forces within the city. With additional control of it, the road is completely blocked, and the Russians can use their positions within the industrial zone as a foothold to push in the northern direction towards the Dacia area, to prevent the Ukrainian supply of their forces through the northern roads down towards Pokrovsk, further solidifying their encirclement of Pokrovsk and Mirnorod here in the western outskirts of the Donetsk region. To the west of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain control over what remains of Molodetsk under Ukrainian control. With this, the Russians have advanced through the railway area towards Molodetsk and gained control over the northern highway road. With this, they have cut off the T0406 highway from entering into the Donetsk region, and from here, the Russians can expand offensive operations towards the industrial area from 3 separate directions from the east, south, and west. Securing the industrial area will allow the Russians to secure the western flank until the end of the Battle of Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. To the southwest of this, the Russians managed to advance along the Yanchur River line, where they've managed to make 2 crossings, one in the northern parts of the Yanchur River near Previlya, gaining control over parts of Slahoda, and one just north of the first line of defense within the Zaporizhzhia region, gaining control over the majority of Nelypivka. The Russians here crossed over from their positions within Novosvasilivsk into the residential area of Nelypivka and are now pushing down towards the fortified positions just to the south of this. With this, the Russian battle over the western bank of the Yanchur River has begun, with several crossings. This is an interesting tactic because the Russians are both taking advantage of the weak point in the Yanchur River line, where they're pushing in the direction of Slahoda, where they're looking to gain control over the settlement and advance down south along the river line, spreading the Ukrainian forces between the northern and southern flanks, while also storming the Ukrainian positions at their strongest defensive area, along their fortifications, as well as the concentration of residential areas here along the Yanchur River, which complicates these advances of the Russians. But the Russians have managed to break through the Ukrainian defenses in the area, cross over the river line, and establish themselves in the western bank. If they manage to then gain control over the fortifications along the road between Poltavka and Nelypivka, then they'll be able to gain control over the supply route that leads through without having to cross over a river line and up towards the central residential area north of these fortifications, allowing for additional supply lines into these positions and stronger Russian presence in the area to gain full control over the settlements along the Yanchur River. In the northern flank, the Russians crossed over from Previlya towards the western bank of the Yanchur River and gained control over the first residential buildings within Slahoda, where we see the shield kit footage confirming the Russian presence in the area. So with this, the Russians have not just secured the town of Slahoda, but also the border section between the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia region in the northern flank, but it also confirms a Ukrainian presence in the first lines to the east of this, which the Russians are working to bypass through their push along the Yanchur River. The Russian bypassed these Ukrainian forward positions and are now working on outflanking them by advancing along the Yanchur River line and cutting off their retreat along the Yanchur River. If Russians are able to quickly gain control over the river line, the Ukrainians will not make it in time to withdraw back across it and re-establish defensive positions along geographical barriers such as the Yanchur River. With this, the Russians are outflanking the Ukrainian forces by launching a risky maneuver, which so far is seeing success. To the south of Poltavka, the Russians continue offensive operations on the western flank of the settlement to gain control over the flank of the settlement, securing the road that leads through Nelypivka up towards Poltavka, and to establish a proper supply line further north once the Russians capture the fortifications along the first defensive line. This will secure the Russian supply lines and shorten it from a wide road from Velika Novosilka in the east all the way down south towards the forward positions, but instead bypassing the Velika Novosilka direction in its entirety and pushing in the direction of Poltavka, which limits the areas Velika Novosilka is responsible for supplying. In the vicinity of Oryhiv, there has not been any concrete advances as of yet. There is the shield-kitted footage that confirms a Russian push within Tokmachka, reaching past the prison area in the southern outskirts of the settlement, where Russian forces are present deep within Tokmachka. The Ukrainians withdrew to the western parts of the settlement, where they are focusing on attacking the Russian forces with FPV drones. The question here is whether the Russians will be able to consolidate the positions that they have gained through this push. But it wasn't a lone push. According to Deep State Map, the push also came in the direction of Nelypivka and Yanzury, where the Russians are looking to gain control over the settlements on the outskirts of Orikhiv. We're already seeing offensive operations by the Russians on the flanks of these fortifications, which could redirect all of the Ukrainian forces from these forward positions. They will eventually be captured if the flanks are lost. So the Ukrainians would focus on establishing defensive positions and holding the defenses on the flanks to prevent a Russian flanking maneuver, outflanking the fortifications and attacking them from the rear, as they have been for the past months, to instead stopping these advances and forcing the Russians to advance head on. With the Russian push in the direction of Tokmachka, Nelypivka, and Nelypivka, they are looking to prevent the Ukrainians from focusing all of their forces and having them keep some of their forces along the defensive lines themselves. The Russians are unlikely to meet any major success with these pushes. They may gain control over Tokmachka, Nelypivka, and Yanchur through weeks of fighting, but they will never be able to capture Orikhiv without major losses. Instead, they will be doubling down on their flanking maneuvers, where we're seeing these river crossings taking place at the same time as they push towards Tokmachka. This pushes the Ukrainians in a difficult position where they have to prioritize where to defend and where to prioritize their supplies and manpower, which are limited. In the northern section of the front line, the Russians managed to push into Shahove from the western flank, following the Ukrainian counterattack into Nelypivka. The Russians are here working on gaining a foothold within Shahove by attacking from both the eastern and western flanks into the settlement. The Russians have gained a foothold in the northwestern parts of Shahove, cutting off the road connecting from the rear of Shahove through the fortifications and up to the northwestern flank of Shahove. With this, the Russians are working here to cut off Shahove itself from the final supply line leading into the settlement, with the eastern and northwestern roads cut off. The final northern road is now also being worked on. This takes place as the Ukrainians have been counterattacking in the vicinity of Nelypivka, which raises the question as to why the Ukrainians are working on counterattacking in the direction of Nelypivka while the Russians are working on the flanks of Shahove. While it is accurate that the Ukrainian forces, although encircled if they are not in large numbers, can be resupplied through the usage of drones, this does not mean that they can get additional reinforcements with the use of drones. The drones cannot carry humans, only equipment. So with this, it is clear that whatever Ukrainian forces have gained a foothold within Nelypivka, they may sit there for a while they're being bombarded by Russian artillery and drones, but they will not be able to gain additional forces in there as long as the Russians cut off the roads into Shahove. If the Russians gain control over Shahove and Nelypivka, the northern flank would have been completely secured for their forces operating further north in the direction of Kupiansk, Shahove, and Vilna, and it will allow the Russians to continue offensive operations along the Yanzury River towards Zaporizhzhia, Toretsk, and other settlements along the defensive line, connecting Pokrovsk in the south to Drushkivka in the north. To the south of Kupiansk, the Russians made a push in the northern flank of Yanchur and Alexandro-Kalinove, gaining control over the fortifications on the outskirts of the settlement and pushing along the highway up towards Kupiansk. The Russians are here working on the forest patch area and the fortifications to prevent the Ukrainian presence in the area and gain control over the highway leading up to Kupiansk further north. It is unlikely that the Russians will push in the direction of Kupiansk from the southern road. As we can see, the T0504 highway is very open. It is out in the open fields, and there's numerous fortifications the Russians will have to push through without any cover, which makes it practically impossible to push into Kupiansk without heavy losses. However, regaining control over the fortifications here to the south of Kupiansk will allow the Russians to secure the northern flank of Yanchur, which will allow them to concentrate their forces for offensive operations in the western flank of Kupiansk towards Stepanivka, Dovhabelka, Roskishne, and so on, to cut off the southern roads leading into Kupiansk from the western flank. Getting control over these settlements as well as Nelypivka will allow the Russians to pressure the Ukrainian supply lines leading into Kupiansk from the northwest. It also puts some pressure off the Russian offensive operations in the vicinity of Lypivka and even Nelypivka to the south of Kupiansk. Further north, the Russians have managed to make additional advances on the eastern and northeastern flanks of Lyman, gain control over the fortifications on the outskirts of Yanchur in the northern flank, securing the railway road all the way to the first line of defense outside of Lyman from the eastern direction, and additional parts of the forest patch area on the western flank of Yanchur. The Russians are here continuing the offensive operations on the eastern flank of Lyman to gain control over the fortifications and start the battle over the city itself. To the north of Zaporizhzhia to gain control over the forest line, here to the southwest of Merne, reaching the outskirts of the road connecting Zaporizhzhia towards Stavki. The Russians now have control over all positions except for 2 fortifications along the road, where the Russians will look to gain control over these remaining fortifications, connecting the road from Zaporizhzhia in the east to Zaporizhzhia in the west. At the same time, the road is now open for the Russians to start attacking Stavki with the northeastern flank secure. They have additional forces to operate here in the direction of Stavki, where they can start storming the settlement, gain control over the fortifications, gain control over the roads leading up to Zaporizhzhia, and allowing them to flank the settlement, the western flank of Lyman, from its rear. This will also allow them to start pressuring on the first line of defense, not just in the eastern flank, but on the northern flank as well. Further north in the Kupiansk section of the front line, the Russians failed to consolidate their positions within Pishana following the capture of the settlement. The Ukrainians, with a counterattack, managed to regain control over the settlement and push the Russians back out of it. This confirms one thing, and that is that the Ukrainian forces here to the east of the Yanzury River line have not withdrawn and aren't withdrawing as it is right now. Instead, they are counterattacking and regaining positions, and this shows that the Ukrainian presence of forces on the eastern bank of the Yanzury River line is still significant, as the Russians are unable to properly push through. This raises the question as to what they will be doing if the Russians capture Kupiansk and look to cut off their positions by reaching Senkove. The reality is that the Ukrainians are fairly optimistic, as they have started some counterattacks on the western flank of Kupiansk, where they're looking to cut off the roads leading into the city by cutting off their positions near Nelypivka and Nelypivka. They'll be able to cut off the roads that lead into Kupiansk. So the objective of the Ukrainians here is to cut off the Russian positions and encircle their forces operating within Kupiansk. However, the Ukrainian forces are just on the outskirts of Kupiansk. If the Russians gain full control of it, they can establish defensive positions on the southern and western flanks and counterattack the Ukrainian forces in the north. And with additional forces operating in the vicinity of Nelypivka and Kalinove, they'll be able to counterattack and pincer the Ukrainian forces. Therefore, the Ukrainians are doing an optimistic push. If they succeed, they can gain a major success. If they fail, it is catastrophic for them, and they risk encircling a major grouping of their forces on the eastern bank of the Yanzury River line. Finally, along the border between the Kharkiv and Belgorod region, the Russians made an additional advance in the vicinity of the town of Nelypivka, here along the border, which is the final settlement along the border between the Russian forces operating along the Yanzury River line with the ones operating along the Russo-Ukrainian border. So with this, the Russians have started storming one of the final settlements that allows the Russians to connect their forces between the Yanzury River line and the northern section. They also have the settlement of Zaporizhzhia, which they will need to gain control of to connect some of the roads here between Kupiansk in the south and Nelypivka, Zaporizhzhia, and Counterattacks in the north. The Russian presence here is mostly just infantry as they push through from one forest line into another to consolidate some positions and build up some fortifications as a buffer zone between the Russian and Ukrainian side of the border. As the Russians stated, they want to create a buffer zone all along the border, which is a few kilometers deep, to prevent a Ukrainian offensive from pushing into Russian territory. That is at least what it looks like for now. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.